The history of China begins long before the recorded dynasties, in a time when vast plains were shaped by the two great rivers that would give rise to one of the oldest civilizations in the world, the Yellow River, also called Huanghe, and the Yangtze River. These rivers were not only sources of water and life, they were the true axes of survival for nomadic tribes and early farmers who thousands of years ago learned to tame the fertile soil along their banks. With every flood, the Yellow River spread its fertile silt, creating an ideal terrain for the cultivation of sorghum and millet, crops that would sustain entire communities. It was in this scenario of challenges and opportunities that the first human groups began to build permanent villages, leaving behind a nomadic life and creating deep bonds with the land. Over millennia, these groups evolved in organization, technology, and beliefs. Archaeological remains found at sites such as Yangshao and Longshan reveal that these communities developed refined ceramics, polished stone tools, and the rudiments of animal domestication. But more than material advances, it was during this period that the founding myths emerged, which would shape the spirit of the Chinese people. Legends of almost divine figures, such as Fuxi, Nua, and the legendary Yellow Emperor, are remembered as the first to teach humankind cultivation, fishing, writing, and the basic laws of coexistence. These mythological characters are not just stories for entertainment. They represent the profound bond between humans and nature, the quest for order in a chaotic world, and the awareness that the collective is stronger than the individual. Over time, these small rural communities transformed into more structured villages, capable of building rudimentary earthen walls for protection against invaders and wild animals. What began as isolated settlements soon expanded into networks of exchange with increasingly organized lives. Archaeology shows that even in this remote period, early Chinese society began to stratify. Tribal leaders emerged, responsible for making decisions that went beyond hunting and harvesting. And here we see one of the most striking aspects of what would be the future of the Chinese people, the idea that order and hierarchy would be essential to face life's challenges. The first experiments with more advanced agriculture, the use of simple irrigation systems, and the domestication of pigs, dogs, and chickens allowed villages to prosper, increasing both population and social complexity. It did not take long for the first proto-urban centers to arise from this base, spreading like seeds along fertile valleys. At the same time, spirituality developed. Burial remains show that these peoples believed in life after death and had a sense of respect for their ancestors, something that would become one of the most important cultural pillars of Chinese civilization. With this foundation, the banks of the Yellow River became the cradle of a culture that slowly gained its own identity. Even without written records from that time, oral tradition preserved stories of a land destined for great empires, and it was precisely in this crucible of untamed nature and human ingenuity that the first seeds of what would one day be called China emerged, a territory that even thousands of years later still carries the strength of these humble beginnings. The Xia Dynasty is remembered in Chinese tradition as the first major step toward the formation of the empire, while at the same time it is surrounded by a veil of mystery that makes its history a meeting point between legend and archaeology. According to classical records, the Xia would have ruled between the years 2070 before Christ and 1600 before Christ, a period in which the villages along the banks of the Yellow River were transformed into more complex communities, marking the beginning of the first centralized political structures that would give rise to imperial Chinese culture. Legend says it all began with the Great Yu, called Yu the Great, a legendary hero whose greatest achievement was controlling the devastating floods that ravaged the territory, using canals and drainage systems that saved the population and allowed agricultural growth. This feat was so extraordinary that, according to tradition, the grateful people chose Yu as their leader, and from him was born the first hereditary dynasty in China. Despite the strong presence of this narrative in ancient texts, such as the Classic of Documents, the question of the actual existence of the Xia dynasty was for centuries a subject of intense debate among scholars. For a long time, it was believed that Xia was only a symbolic story to explain the beginning of Chinese organization. However, recent archaeological discoveries, especially the excavations at Elitu in Henan province, have revealed evidence of a complex Bronze Age society that may correspond to this dynasty. Remains of palaces, Jade artifacts, bronze utensils, and an organized urban layout indicate that a centralized power structure indeed existed in that region long before the documented rise of the Xia Dynasty. Regardless of where myth ends and reality begins, the cultural importance attributed to Xia is immense. It represents the first time that the concept of governance and authority, based on hereditary lineage, appears in the Chinese context. This concept would influence the entire political future of the country, where ruling meant not only leading militarily, but also protecting the people from the forces of nature. The figure of Yu the Great symbolizes this relationship between the ruler and the balance of the world. The leader is seen as one who harmonizes the earthly and celestial orders, inaugurating a model of leadership that would endure for millennia. From a social perspective, this period is believed to have been marked by the transition from small isolated villages to more organized regional centers, with specialized artisans, rudimentary trade networks, and greater control over water and agricultural resources. The ability to manage water, build dikes and canals, and tame the environment was essential for food security and for the emergence of the first forms of administration. There is evidence that during this time, ancestral cults and ceremonies connected to the forces of nature began to take shape, practices that shaped the Chinese spiritual mindset and established the foundation for the central role of rituals in political power. The history of the Xia Dynasty is also the story of the birth of a collective identity, in which the clans and tribes scattered across the land began to recognize themselves as part of something greater. Although no written records from this era have survived, the objects left behind tell a silent story of cultural evolution and organization. The legacy of Yu and Xia lies not only in legends, but in the way it symbolizes the beginning of a path that would lead China from villages to dynasties, always with the notion that to govern is to serve the people and maintain balance between humans and the forces of nature. The Xia Dynasty marks the beginning of Chinese history, in which myth and fact finally start to converge through concrete evidence. Reigning approximately between 1600 before Christ and 1046 before Christ, the Xia left a legacy that can be identified through archaeology, bronze artifacts, ruins of fortified cities, and most importantly, the earliest known forms of Chinese writing. Unlike the Xia Dynasty, whose existence relies heavily on oral traditions and much later texts, the Xia provides us with physical evidence of a structured power and an advanced culture that began to consolidate along the banks of the Yellow River. The most impressive feature of the Xia was their absolute mastery of bronze metallurgy. They created weapons, tools, and ritual vessels on a scale that few civilizations of the time could match. These objects were not only utilitarian, but also symbols of power and connection with the divine. Every cast piece carried the weight of the authority of the kings, who saw themselves as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Xia society was rigidly hierarchical, and at the top was the king, who centralized both military power and religious authority, making decisions about the kingdom's future based on the messages he believed he received from the heavens. It is in this context that the famous oracle bones appear, one of the most important discoveries in Chinese history. Pieces of turtle shell and ox bones were prepared and heated until they cracked. The cracks were then interpreted by priests as answers from ancestors or gods to the king's questions. These questions were carved directly into the bones, giving rise to the oldest known form of Chinese writing. Thanks to these records, we know that Xia rulers consulted the oracles to decide everything, from military campaigns to harvests and rituals, and even to know if the weather would be favorable or not. These bones, preserved for thousands of years, are the first direct testimony of the religious and administrative mindset of this civilization. Beyond their religious practices, the organization of the Xia Dynasty demonstrates an impressive level of complexity. They developed more advanced irrigation systems, built fortified cities with rammed earth walls, and created a disciplined army that used horse-drawn chariots, an innovative technology for the period. Urban life grew around these centers, where artisans produced bronze and jade objects, while the rural population worked on cereal cultivation. This growth, however, also depended on a tribute system imposed by the king, which further strengthened central power and cemented a culture of obedience and reverence toward authority. Xia spirituality was deeply marked by the veneration of ancestors. It was believed that the spirits of the ancestors continued to influence the lives of the living, and that, through offerings and rituals, protection and prosperity could be obtained. This connection between the living and the dead became one of the enduring foundations of Chinese culture. The kings were not just rulers, they were supreme priests who ensured that this communication with the spiritual world was maintained, and by doing so, legitimized their own power. The ruins of Yin, the last capital of the Shang dynasty, still reveal today the grandeur of this period. Thousands of oracle bones, weapons, chariots, and ritual objects have been found there, confirming that this kingdom was a cultural and technological power far beyond what was previously imagined. The Shang dynasty established the foundations of writing, consolidated the power of rituals, and created a centralized model of government that would shape all future dynasties. When it finally fell to the next great force, the Zhou dynasty, it left behind not only ruins and bronzes, but also the first solid layer of China's documented history. With the fall of the Shang dynasty in 1046 before Christ, a new power took control of the lands along the Yellow River, marking the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, one of the longest and most influential in all of Chinese history, lasting until 256 before Christ. This period was not just a change of power, it was a turning point that brought with it a political, philosophical, and social revolution, permanently shaping the concepts that would support Chinese civilization for the next millennia. The justification presented by the Zhou to legitimize their rise to power became one of the most important ideological pillars in Chinese thought, the mandate of heaven. According to this idea, the right to govern came not only from strength or heredity, but from divine approval, which granted power to a just ruler. When an emperor became corrupt and ineffective, the heavens withdrew this approval, opening the way for another clan to take the throne. This notion of legitimacy would be used repeatedly throughout Chinese history. The beginning of the Zhou dynasty is often divided into two major phases, Western Zhou and Eastern Zhou. During the early period, known as the Western Zhou, the royal family ruled in a relatively centralized way, controlling vast expanses of land distributed among relatives and allies in a system similar to feudalism. These regional lords were obligated to pay tribute and provide military support to the king, but over time this structure began to weaken central authority as these local families gained autonomy and started acting like small independent rulers. This political weakening later resulted in a long phase of decentralization and internal conflicts. It was in the Eastern Zhou, particularly starting in the 8th century before Christ, that China entered an extremely turbulent period known as the Spring and Autumn period, followed by the Warring States period. Although political fragmentation led to constant wars among rival states, it also created fertile ground for intellectual and cultural innovation. It was in this context that the so-called 100 schools of thought emerged, a burst of ideas seeking answers to restore order and harmony in times of chaos. Figures like Confucius, Laozi, and many others appeared with proposals that would influence not only politics and ethics, but the entire social structure of China. The importance of Confucianism, born during this time, cannot be underestimated. Based on principles of morality, respect for elders, hierarchy, and social harmony, this philosophy would later become the foundation of the Chinese state. Alongside Confucianism, Taoism flourished, advocating a life in balance with nature and a pursuit of simplicity and non-interference. Another powerful current that emerged during this period was legalism, which promoted order through strict laws and severe punishments. This diversity of ideas shows how the challenges of fragmentation were able to generate an intellectual legacy that would last far beyond the Zhou era. From a cultural and technological perspective, the Zhou dynasty was an age of significant innovations. The use of iron began to spread, increasing the efficiency of agricultural tools and weapons of war. New agricultural techniques allowed the expansion of food production, helping to sustain increasingly larger populations. In addition, detailed rituals were created that reinforced social hierarchy and strengthened the sense of community, linking political power to cultural tradition. Music, poetry, and calligraphy also flourished in this dynamic environment, leaving works that are still considered classics of Chinese culture today. Despite all these advances, the end of the Zhou dynasty was marked by the collapse of central power. Rival states became increasingly strong and independent, turning China into a mosaic of warring territories. This instability would lead to the next period of great conflicts, but also prepare the way for one of the most decisive moments in history, unification under the Qin dynasty. Thus the Zhou dynasty, with all its glories and challenges, left behind a deep philosophical and political foundation, a model of celestial legitimacy, and a vivid portrait of how Chinese culture managed to thrive even amid chaos. During the long duration of the Zhou dynasty, especially in the period known as the Spring and Autumn era, and later during the Warring States, China plunged into a constant state of disorder, where kings and local lords endlessly fought for power. Paradoxically, it was precisely this time of instability that created space for one of the richest phases of ideas in the entire history of humanity. This intellectual flourishing became known as the period of the 100 Schools of Thought, a symbolic name that represents the diversity of philosophies that emerged to try to understand and offer solutions for political chaos, social injustice, and the search for balance between humanity and the order of the universe. It was in this crucible of conflicts and reflections that figures like Confucius and Laozi were born, whose teachings would shape the way of thinking of the Chinese people for millennia. Among all these currents, Confucianism stood out as a proposal based on morality, ethics, and social harmony. Confucius, or Kongfuzi, argued that the foundation of a just government was not force but virtue, and that stability could only be achieved when rulers and citizens fulfilled their roles with responsibility. His teachings focused on respect for elders, family loyalty, justice, and the necessity of education as a path to wisdom. For him, the order of society was a reflection of the order within the family and the correct conduct of each individual. This vision became so powerful that centuries later, it was transformed into an official state ideology, influencing institutions, education, and the behavior of the Chinese people for generations. While Confucianism sought to structure society through moral discipline, Taoism, associated with Laozi, proposed an entirely different path, centered on the search for natural balance and simplicity. In Taoist thought, the universe follows its own flow, called the Tao, and human beings must learn to live in harmony with it, avoiding excesses and understanding the importance of gentleness and patience. For Laozi, strength did not lie in imposing orders, but in aligning oneself with the natural course of things, allowing balance to emerge spontaneously. This philosophy profoundly influenced not only religion, but also the arts, traditional medicine, and Chinese spirituality. Another extremely influential school of thought was legalism, which arose more strongly toward the end of this period. Unlike the approaches of Confucius and Laozi, legalism was practical and strict. It believed that human beings tended towards selfishness and disorder, and that only rigid laws applied with severe punishments could ensure stability. This vision found direct application in the politics of the Qin dynasty, which would later unify China by imposing inflexible discipline. Although often considered harsh and unpopular, legalism created an efficient administrative system capable of organizing and controlling vast territories. In addition to these three most well-known schools, this period was a breeding ground for ideas where Mohism also flourished, which preached universal love and the rejection of unjust wars, along with other lesser-known currents that sought to explain social and natural order. The result of this intellectual environment was a wealth of debates that transformed the way the Chinese viewed life, politics, and the cosmos. Texts such as the Analects of Confucius and the Tao Te Ching of Laozi became fundamental works for the cultural formation of the country, transcending their time and continuing to inspire readers to this day. These ideas, born in a context of chaos, were seeds planted in the collective mind of China, shaping centuries of governance, philosophy, and way of life. What began as a desperate search for answers amid war and fragmentation ultimately became the cultural and moral foundation of an entire civilization, preparing it for the moment when a strong and centralized power would re-emerge, bringing with it the promise of unification. The Warring States period, which extended approximately from 475 before Christ to 221 before Christ, represents one of the most intense and violent chapters in Chinese history, but also one of the most transformative. After the weakening of the central power of the Zhou dynasty, China ceased to be a unified territory and became a mosaic of independent states, each governed by leaders seeking to expand their borders and impose their supremacy. The result was a virtually uninterrupted war among 7 great states, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, who fought for more than 2 centuries, transforming the political, social, and military landscape of ancient China. Although these centuries were dominated by conflict, they were also a time of unprecedented technological and organizational advances. With constant warfare, the states developed new weapons, perfected tactics, and strengthened their armies. It was during this period that iron definitively replaced bronze in the manufacture of weapons, increasing the efficiency of soldiers. More powerful bows, crossbows with sophisticated mechanisms, and faster military chariots gave a new dimension to the battlefield. In addition, the organization of armies became increasingly complex, with rigid hierarchical structures and well-defined strategies, establishing a model of warfare that would be followed for centuries. But the impact of this period goes far beyond battles. The constant struggle for survival led states to invest in building walls and defense systems, and also to develop much more efficient administrations. In several regions, land was redistributed, tax systems became more sophisticated, and governments began to directly control agricultural production, the economy, and even the mobilization of the population for military purposes. This quest for efficiency ended up creating increasingly powerful and centralized states that, even in times of war, managed to make agriculture and engineering flourish. One of the deepest effects of this scenario of rivalry was the acceleration of intellectual development. Philosophers, strategists, and scholars sought solutions to the challenges of war and politics. Among the most influential figures of this period is Sun Tzu, author of The Art of War, a treatise on strategy and discipline that would become a classic not only in China, but throughout the world. The competition among the states created an atmosphere in which innovation and wisdom were seen as weapons as important as swords and spears. Culturally, the Warring States period also witnessed the strengthening of legal systems and the expansion of the schools of thought that had emerged in the previous period. This intellectual effervescence prepared the ground for profound changes that would take place immediately after this time of blood and rivalry. Society came to value even more discipline, obedience, and administrative capacity, qualities that would later be taken to the extreme by one particular state, Qin. As the conflict progressed, Qin emerged as the most ambitious and disciplined of all. Its strength lay in an organized army, rigid laws, and the ability to centralize resources and people for the war effort. At the end of this devastating period, Qin would emerge victorious, becoming the power that, for the first time in history, would unify all of China under a single government. But while that unification had not yet arrived, the warring states left an indelible mark. A country forged in war, in the pursuit of order, and in the conviction that survival depended on strength and strategy. The end of the long and turbulent warring states period came with the rise of the state of Qin, a kingdom that stood out for its military discipline, its strict application of legalism, and its remarkable capacity for organization. In 221 before Christ, under the visionary and relentless leadership of Yingzheng, Qin defeated all the other rival states and unified China for the first time in history. Yingzheng then assumed an unprecedented title, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. This moment marks the beginning of the Qin dynasty and represents the definitive transition from a fragmented territory to a centralized empire, creating the foundation of the political model that would shape China for the next 2 millennia. The rule of Qin Shi Huang was characterized by deep administrative centralization. To eliminate any trace of regional autonomy, he reorganized the territory into provinces directly controlled by officials loyal to the emperor, putting an end to the influence of local nobility. This centralized administration was accompanied by radical standardization measures. Weights and measures were unified, coins were given a single format, the axles of carts were standardized, and even writing was unified, creating a system that facilitated trade, communication, and control over an immense territory. These reforms, although harsh, gave China an unprecedented cohesion. Among the most monumental projects of this period was the initial construction of the Great Wall. Although walls already existed in previous kingdoms, Qin Shi Huang ordered them to be connected and expanded, creating a massive barrier against invasions from the north, especially by the nomadic peoples of the steppes. This feat required a colossal human effort, involving hundreds of thousands of workers who endured brutal conditions. Although the wall we see today was rebuilt and expanded in later periods, it was under Qin that this idea first took shape as a symbol of defense and unity. Another impressive legacy of the first emperor is his mausoleum, guarded by the famous terracotta army. Located near Xi'an, this underground army is composed of thousands of life-sized soldiers, each with unique expressions and details, armed and arranged in battle formation. Sculpted to protect the emperor in the afterlife, these statues remain one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the world, bearing witness to the grandeur and ambition of this period. But the Qin dynasty was also marked by its severity. The legalist philosophy applied with relentless rigor resulted in extremely harsh punishments for those who disobeyed the laws. Books that were not of interest to the government were burned, and scholars considered dangerous to the stability of the regime were persecuted. These radical measures, while ensuring absolute control, also created an atmosphere of fear and resentment among the population. The pursuit of order and efficiency ultimately became oppressive. Despite its achievements, the Qin dynasty was extremely short-lived, lasting only 15 years. After the death of Qin Shi Huang in 210 before Christ, the empire plunged into internal crises and popular revolts, which soon led to the rise of a new dynasty. However, even though it was brief, the Qin dynasty left a profound impact. It consolidated the idea of a unified empire, laid the foundations of centralized administration, initiated monumental infrastructure projects, and established the political identity that would continue to shape China for centuries to come. The unification brought about by the Qin was not only territorial, it was also symbolic. For the first time, the peoples who lived along the vast valleys of the Yellow River and beyond saw themselves as part of the same political entity, one that carried the promise of order amid chaos. This ideal of unity and centralization would become a constant in Chinese history, a direct legacy of the power and vision of the first emperor. With the fall of the short but striking Qin dynasty, China plunged into internal conflicts until a new force emerged and ushered in one of the most important and enduring eras in Chinese history, the Han Dynasty, which ruled from 206 before Christ to 220 after Christ. This period is considered by many as the true consolidation of Chinese civilization. So much so that even today the majority ethnic group of China calls itself the Han people, a reflection of the cultural and political influence of this time. Under the Han, China not only rose again from the chaos that followed the death of Qin Shi Huang, but also flourished in every aspect: territory, economy, science, culture, and diplomacy. At the beginning of the Han government, Emperor Gaozu Liubang, founder of the dynasty, abolished some of the harshest laws of the previous regime and sought to balance the legalist rigidity inherited from the Qin with the moral values of Confucianism. This integration of philosophical systems would become the foundation of Han administration. From the reign of Emperor Wu, known as Han Wudi, the dynasty reached the height of its territorial expansion, incorporating vast regions that stretched from Vietnam in the south, across Manchuria, reaching Korea, and advancing into the steppes of Central Asia. It was under his leadership that China began to open a route that would forever change the economic history of the world: the Silk Road. The Silk Road emerged as a network of paths that connected China to the West, enabling the trade of silk, spices, paper, precious metals, and countless other products. This network of exchanges was not limited to goods. It also promoted an unprecedented cultural interchange, taking out of China not only its products, but also its ideas, technology, and worldview, while bringing into the empire new knowledge and foreign influences. This openness was one of the driving forces that transformed China into a cosmopolitan center during the Han era. In addition to trade, the Han were responsible for significant advances in science and technology. Paper, for example, was invented during this period, revolutionizing the way information was recorded. The development of techniques in astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, and agriculture elevated the sophistication of the empire. More efficient irrigation systems, new iron tools, and improvements in roads helped increase agricultural production and facilitate the movement of armies and goods. This economic and technological growth further strengthened the centralization of imperial power. Culturally, the Han consolidated Confucianism as the foundation of education and public administration. Examinations were created to select officials not only by heredity, but by merit, introducing a notion of bureaucracy that was more organized and based on learning. This measure brought administrative stability and elevated education as one of the pillars of the empire. At the same time, the arts flourished. Music, poetry, painting, and sculpture thrived, often sponsored by the imperial court. Historical literature also achieved notable advances, with the compilation of detailed records that still serve today as valuable sources to understand that period. Despite all its prosperity, the Han Dynasty faced challenges. Internal conflicts, political disputes, and external pressures from nomadic peoples such as the Xiongnu weakened the empire's strength over the centuries. Eventually, these tensions led to its division, and later, its collapse. But the legacy left by the Han was so profound that the political, cultural, and administrative model established during this period would continue to serve as a reference for future dynasties. The Han transformed China into a respected and feared power, built bridges with the outside world, and consolidated a national identity. Under their rule, the idea of China acquired clearer and more permanent outlines, with expanded borders and a deeper sense of unity. It was a true golden age, marked by a balance between strength and culture, discipline and innovation, leaving a legacy that echoes to this day. With the definitive fall of the Han Dynasty in the year 220 after Christ, China plunged into one of the most dramatic, violent, and at the same time fascinating periods of its entire history, the era of the Three Kingdoms. This phase, which lasted until the year 280 after Christ, was marked by the fragmentation of power into three major rival states, Wei, Shu, and Wu, which fought relentlessly for control of Chinese territory through a series of military campaigns, political intrigues, and treacherous alliances. It was a short period in duration, but so intense that it became one of the great historical and literary myths of Chinese culture, immortalized in the work Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written centuries later, which turned generals and rulers into true epic heroes. The collapse of the Han structure left an immense power vacuum. Internal tensions, popular revolts, and corruption weakened the central government to the point where regional leaders, known as warlords, began to govern their areas independently. Among these leaders stood out figures such as Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan, whose personalities and strategies shaped this entire period. Cao Cao, leader of the state of Wei, was known for his political cunning and military skill, building an efficient administration and a powerful army. Liu Bei of the state of Shu became a symbol of loyalty and virtue, surrounding himself with legendary advisors and generals such as Zhuge Liang, a strategist whose tactics are still studied today. Sun Quan, at the head of the state of Wu, consolidated his power in the south, using geography and naval control as an advantage. The period of the Three Kingdoms was a time of total war. Monumental battles such as the famous Battle of Red Cliffs, where the allied forces of Shu and Wu defeated Wei's powerful navy through ingenious strategies and the use of fire, became legends. These wars were not just military confrontations, they were also games of intelligence and politics, in which every alliance was fragile and every decision could change the balance of power. The prolonged and devastating campaigns drastically reduced the population, ruined crops, and turned fertile fields into scorched lands. Despite the chaotic scenario, this period was also fertile in terms of military and political culture. New strategies, battle formations, and innovations in logistics were developed. Furthermore, literature and oral tradition kept the deeds of these leaders alive, turning them into symbols of Chinese courage, loyalty, and cunning. Many of the principles of military strategy still revered in the East originated or were perfected during this era. The end of the Three Kingdoms came when the Kingdom of Wei managed, at first, to conquer Shu in 263 after Christ, but was itself taken over by the Sima clan, which founded the Jin dynasty in 265. A few years later, in 280, Jin conquered Wu, reunifying China for a brief period. However, the political and social instability that had begun with the fall of the Han continued to haunt the region, and reunification would be only temporary. The era of the Three Kingdoms, though short and marked by suffering, left a deep mark on Chinese identity. It is remembered not only as a period of destruction, but also as an era in which values such as honor, loyalty, strategy, and intelligence were taken to the extreme. To this day, the stories of this period are told in books, plays, films, and series, transforming battles and political intrigues into narratives that unite history and myth, keeping alive the spirit of a time when China was divided but never stopped dreaming of unity. After the fall of the Three Kingdoms period and the turbulent years of the Jin dynasty and the so-called Northern and Southern dynasties, China remained fragmented for centuries, weakened by internal divisions, invasions, and regional disputes. This long cycle of fragmentation only came to an end in the year 581 after Christ, when the Sui dynasty managed to reunify the empire, once again imposing a centralized government. The Sui dynasty, although brief, was fundamentally important because it laid the administrative and economic foundations that would allow the next great dynasty, the Tang, to transform China into one of the greatest cultural and economic centers of the ancient world. The Sui emperors were responsible for great infrastructure projects, the most famous of which was the construction of the Grand Canal, a monumental feat of engineering that connected the north to the south of China, linking the Yellow River to the Yangtze River. This canal facilitated the transport of grain and resources, strengthened internal communication, and helped stabilize the economy. Another central effort was the administrative and military reorganization of the territory, aimed at creating a more efficient system and avoiding the mistakes of the past. However, disastrous military campaigns against Korea and heavy taxation quickly undermined public confidence in the dynasty, and in 618 it was overthrown, giving way to the Tang. With the rise of the Tang dynasty, China entered a golden age. Considered by many historians to be one of the most advanced civilizations in the world during that period, Tang China became a stable, wealthy, and sophisticated empire. The capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world at that time, a cosmopolitan center that welcomed merchants, diplomats, and artists from various parts of Asia, the Middle East, and even the Byzantine Empire. Land and maritime trade routes expanded even further, consolidating China as a central hub of the Silk Road and enabling an unprecedented exchange of goods, cultures, and ideas. Culturally, the Tang dynasty represented an apex. Literature flourished as never before. Poets such as Li Bai and Du Fu created masterpieces that are still considered literary treasures. Visual arts and painting reached new levels of refinement, while music and dance absorbed foreign influences, enriching cultural diversity. Chinese calligraphy attained a level of aesthetic and philosophical perfection. There were also great scientific and technological advances, including the improvement of block printing, advances in medicine, astronomy, and cartography. Another defining feature of the Tang dynasty was the flourishing of Buddhism in China. Although this religion had already been present since the Han dynasty, it was under the Tang that Buddhism spread deeply through all social classes, influencing art, architecture, and philosophical thought. Great temples and monasteries were built, and the translation of Indian sutras into Chinese allowed Buddhist philosophy to integrate with local culture. The famous journey of the monk Xuanzang to India, which inspired the work Journey to the West, is an example of this intense contact. Politically, the Tang dynasty created a well-structured government system based on an advanced legal code and meritocratic examinations that selected competent officials for the imperial bureaucracy. This meritocracy made the Tang government admired for its efficiency and stability. At the same time, the dynasty maintained a strong army that was able to repel external threats and consolidate vast borders, turning China into a military and diplomatic superpower. However, the greatness of the Tang did not last forever. From the 9th century onward, internal revolts, corruption, and foreign invasions weakened the empire, leading to its fall in 907. But the legacy left by the Sui and Tang was profound. They reunified China after centuries of division, created a prosperous environment for cultural and commercial exchanges, and transformed the country into a center of innovation and art. The idea of a wealthy, open, and culturally vibrant China owes much to the splendor of this period. With the fall of the Tang dynasty in 907 after Christ, China once again plunged into a period of fragmentation known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. This turbulent time, marked by disputes among military clans and regional warlords, only came to an end in 960 after Christ, when General Zhao Kuangyin founded the Song dynasty. This dynasty, which ruled until 1279 after Christ, brought a new kind of stability and ushered in a different phase in Chinese history. Instead of prioritizing military power alone, the Song focused on culture, economy, and technology, building a legacy remembered as one of the most creative and innovative eras in all of Chinese civilization. The Song dynasty is often divided into two phases: the Northern Song 960–1127, with its capital in Kaifeng, and the Southern Song from 1127 to 1279, with its capital in Hangzhou. This division occurred due to the invasion of the Jurchen peoples, who seized the northern part of the empire and forced the Chinese to retreat to the south. Despite this territorial loss, the Southern Song became an extremely dynamic economic and cultural center, with a maritime economy that opened new trade routes, connecting China to Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. The defining feature of this period was an explosion of technological and scientific advances. Under the Song, gunpowder ceased to be merely an alchemical curiosity and began to be used in military applications, giving rise to weapons such as fire lances and rudimentary explosives, forever changing the nature of warfare. Another revolutionary invention was the magnetic compass, which allowed precise navigation and expanded the reach of maritime trade. In the field of sciences, there were notable advances in engineering, hydraulics, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, making the Song period one of the most inventive in history. In addition, the art of printing books with wooden movable type was perfected, making access to knowledge much faster and broader. This advancement allowed learning to spread among scholars and strengthened the academic tradition and the Confucian-based civil service examinations, which were the gateway to government positions. For the first time, China witnessed significant growth in education and the circulation of ideas, with richer libraries and a greater appreciation of study as a path to social advancement. Culturally, the Song dynasty brought unprecedented sophistication. Landscape painting reached an aesthetic refinement that is admired to this day. Poetry also flourished, and Confucian philosophy underwent a renaissance with the emergence of Neo-Confucianism, which reinterpreted classical texts to address the needs of the time. Song ceramics, with their minimalist elegance, became an artistic standard of perfection, sought after even by foreign peoples trading with China. In the economic sphere, the Song were the first in the world to use paper money as currency, creating a more advanced banking system. Internal and external trade grew on an unprecedented scale, supported by roads, canals, and a powerful merchant navy. Cities flourished as centers of exchange and culture, and urban life became more developed than in any other part of the medieval world. However, this prosperity could not protect the dynasty from external threats. The constant pressure from the nomadic peoples of the north, first the Jurchen and later the Mongols, militarily weakened the Song. The lack of a military force equal to their economic power ultimately proved fatal. In 1279, the Mongols, under Kublai Khan, definitively conquered China, bringing an end to the Song dynasty and inaugurating the Yuan era. Even so, the Song legacy is immense. They transformed China into a society based on knowledge, technology, and commerce, and created innovations that changed world history. It was a period in which intellect and creativity flourished, preparing the stage for new phases of the empire, even during times of foreign occupation. With the relentless advance of the steppe tribes led by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century after Christ, the political landscape of Asia began to change dramatically. China, then ruled by the Song dynasty in the south and by the Jurchen people in the north, became one of the major targets of Mongol expansion. The Mongols, known for their impressive mobility, war tactics based on speed and surprise and fierce discipline, launched a campaign that would extend for decades until the entire Chinese territory was subjugated. The conquest of China by the Mongols was not quick. It was a long, brutal process marked by devastating battles, culminating in the creation of the Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, in 1271. The Mongols' first targets were the northern kingdoms, especially the Jurchen Empire, known as Jin, which was defeated after successive campaigns. Then the advance turned toward the southern Song, who resisted for almost half a century before finally falling in 1279. Mongol rule brought a new political order to China. For the first time, the entire Chinese territory became part of a foreign empire, governed by a nomadic elite that introduced new forms of military and administrative organization. Kublai Khan, after consolidating his power, established the capital in Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, and inaugurated the Yuan dynasty. Unlike his warrior predecessors, Kublai proved to be a ruler more inclined toward administration. He maintained much of the Chinese bureaucratic structure, taking advantage of the expertise of Confucian scholars, but also introduced administrative practices inspired by the Mongol model. This blend created a unique form of government in which foreigners held important positions, and there was greater openness to merchants, diplomats, and missionaries from distant regions, something uncommon in earlier Chinese tradition. Under the Yuan, China became a central hub of the largest contiguous empire in history. This period witnessed an intense cultural and commercial exchange, facilitated by the famous Pax Mongolica, which ensured safety along the Silk Road routes. Merchants from Persia, the Middle East, and even Europe came to China, bringing products and ideas. It was in this context that the Venetian Marco Polo arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, leaving detailed accounts of the wealth and organization of China at that time, which fascinated the West for centuries. Despite apparent prosperity, the Yuan dynasty faced serious challenges. The Mongol elite maintained privileges and segregated the Chinese population, creating social tensions. In addition, the vast cultural differences between the rulers and the ruled population formed a barrier difficult to overcome. Peasant uprisings began to multiply, fueled by dissatisfaction with high taxes, administrative corruption, and natural crises such as floods and famine. Culturally, the Yuan period was strongly influenced by foreign presence, but it was also a time of artistic flourishing in certain areas such as painting and theater. Chinese opera, for example, acquired new forms during this era. From a technological perspective, the advances of the song were maintained, and there was encouragement for scientific exchanges between China and other parts of the vast Mongol Empire. The decline of the Yuan began in the 14th century after Christ, when revolts intensified, particularly the Red Turban movement, which combined social discontent with religious motivations. In 1368, these uprisings toppled Mongol rule, leading to the rise of a new, fully Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty. Nevertheless, the Yuan era left important legacies, such as the strengthening of China's contact with the outside world and the integration of the country into global commercial and cultural networks as never before. With the fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 after Christ, China finally freed itself from the foreign rule of the Mongols and entered one of the most remarkable periods in its history, the Ming dynasty, which lasted until 1644. Victory came through the movement known as the Red Turbans, which united peasants and local leaders against the oppression and instability brought by the Yuan government. Zhu Yuanzhang, a former peasant who rose as a brilliant military leader, became the first Ming emperor, taking the name Hongwu. His rise symbolized the return of power to the Chinese people and the beginning of an era of reconstruction, internal strengthening, and national pride. The beginning of the Ming dynasty was marked by a systematic effort to restore order and rebuild the economy devastated by wars and corruption. Hongwu implemented deep reforms. He reduced taxes to ease the suffering of peasants, strengthened agriculture, reorganized the land system, and created a clear and detailed legal code aimed at consolidating social and political discipline. This emphasis on internal strengthening brought a period of stability and demographic growth, with the flourishing of villages and the recovery of internal trade routes. In the 15th century, under the reign of Emperor Yongle, the Ming dynasty experienced a moment of splendor and international projection. Yongle moved the capital to Beijing and began the construction of the monumental Forbidden City, a grand palace complex designed to be the center of imperial power and a symbol of the emperor's absolute authority. This work, which remains one of the greatest cultural heritages of humanity, represents the architectural sophistication and centralizing vision of this period. It was also under Yongle that one of the boldest naval initiatives in Chinese history took place, the voyages of Zheng He. Zheng He, a Muslim-born admiral and explorer, commanded a series of maritime expeditions known as the Seven Great Voyages. which took enormous Chinese fleets to destinations in Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and even the east coast of Africa. These voyages, which occurred between 1405 and 1433, aimed to strengthen trade routes, establish diplomatic contacts, and display the power and wealth of the Chinese Empire. Zheng He's fleets were immense, composed of hundreds of ships, including gigantic treasure ships, that impressed every nation they visited. These expeditions were an unprecedented demonstration of China's naval and logistical capabilities at the time. However, after these voyages, Ming policy changed. From the mid-15th century onward, China adopted a more isolationist stance, reducing international maritime trade and focusing its efforts on internal strengthening. This included the reconstruction and expansion of the Great Wall as a defense against threats from the north, especially the remaining Mongols. Although this wall had existed in earlier periods, the works carried out under the Ming gave the Great Wall the monumental form by which it is best known today. During the Ming era, culture flourished intensely. Chinese porcelain reached its peak, becoming an extremely valued product around the world. Literature was consolidated with the creation of classic novels, and visual arts and philosophy prospered. Large-scale printing allowed for a wider dissemination of knowledge, and Confucian education continued to shape the bureaucratic elite. Despite all its achievements, the Ming dynasty faced increasing difficulties at the end of its rule. Internal problems such as corruption, peasant revolts, economic crises, and external pressures from the Manchus in the northeast gradually weakened the empire. In 1644, the capital Beijing was taken by the Manchus, marking the end of the Ming dynasty and the beginning of a new foreign dynasty, the Qing dynasty. Even so, the Ming legacy remained one of the most important in Chinese history. It was a period of national self-confidence, architectural grandeur, cultural expansion, and naval achievements that placed China at the center of the known world. The Forbidden City and the voyages of Zheng He remain eternal symbols of this era that sought above all to demonstrate the strength and vitality of the empire. When the Ming dynasty collapsed in 1644 after Christ, after years of internal crises, corruption and popular uprisings, power passed into the hands of the Manchus, a people from northeastern China. These conquerors founded the Qing dynasty, which would become the last imperial dynasty of China, ruling until 1912. Unlike other periods of foreign domination, the Manchus managed to consolidate their authority and for nearly 2 centuries brought stability, territorial expansion, and a new period of splendor to China. This was a time when the empire reached one of the largest extensions in its history, while gradually beginning to face the challenges of a modernizing world. In the early reigns, especially under Emperors Kangxi from 1661 to 1722 and Qianlong from 1735 to 1796, China experienced a phase of unprecedented prosperity. Kangxi, one of the most educated rulers in Chinese history, strengthened administration, promoted scientific studies, and supported major infrastructure works. During his rule and that of Qianlong, China's territory expanded greatly, incorporating regions such as Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Taiwan, establishing borders close to those we know today. These emperors also promoted a cultural flourishing, sponsoring artists, poets, and scholars, compiling vast encyclopedias of knowledge, and consolidating traditions that became symbols of Chinese culture. Culturally, the Qing embraced Confucian traditions while preserving their Manchu identity, creating a system that integrated Chinese elites through imperial examinations, but reserved key positions of power for their own clans. Art and literature entered a very rich period, and Qing architecture refined the grand style of the Forbidden City. The agrarian economy prospered during the 17th and 18th centuries, supported by intensive farming and a massive population growth. However, starting in the 19th century, the Qing dynasty began to face a dramatic decline. The outside world, especially European powers, began pressuring China for trade and political influence. This pressure erupted into the so-called Opium Wars, when England, exploiting the widespread addiction to opium, imposed unequal treaties after devastating military victories. These defeats humiliated China and opened ports and trade concessions by force, marking the beginning of a period known as the Century of Humiliation. In addition to external aggression, massive internal rebellions shook the throne. The most famous of these, the Taiping Rebellion, from from 1850 to 1864, led by a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, created a movement that seized vast areas in the south, sparking one of the bloodiest civil wars in history, with millions of deaths. Another significant revolt was the Boxer Rebellion at the end of the 19th century, which attempted to expel foreigners and missionaries, but was crushed by an international coalition. These uprisings, combined with military defeats, revealed the fragility of an empire that could no longer modernize as fast as the West. Meanwhile, attempts at modernization reforms came too late. The imperial court was divided between those who supported changes and conservatives who feared losing power. Empress Dowager Cixi, a dominant figure in the last years of the dynasty, is often associated with decisions that delayed the modernization of the country, contributing to the empire's decline. At the beginning of the 20th century, the accumulation of internal and external crises made the end of the imperial regime inevitable. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution overthrew the last emperor, Puyi, and proclaimed the Republic of China in 1912, ending more than 2,000 years of dynastic rule. Thus, the Qing dynasty came to an end, leaving behind both years of splendor and expansion and the deep scars of humiliation suffered. The Qing dynasty represents one of the most complex periods in Chinese history. It was able to raise China to a level of unprecedented territorial and cultural power, but it also witnessed its slow decline in the face of the forces of a rapidly modernizing world. It was the last dynasty, and its end opened the doors to a new and turbulent chapter in the country's history. After the initial era of splendor of the Qing dynasty, China entered one of the darkest periods in its history, known as the Century of Humiliation. This term refers to the interval between the mid-19th century and the first half of the 20th century, when the weakened empire suffered a series of military defeats, foreign impositions, and internal upheavals that left deep scars on the nation. The roots of this collapse lay in the difficulty of modernizing at the same pace as the West, and in the devastating impact of forced contact with the industrial powers of Europe. The breaking point came with the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842. For decades, British merchants had been smuggling opium into China, causing a social and public health crisis. When Chinese authorities tried to suppress this destructive trade, England responded with military force. The Chinese defeat was swift and humiliating, leading to the Treaty of Nanking, which forced China to open ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong to the British, and pay enormous indemnities. This war was a turning point, as it revealed China's military weakness in the face of European technological superiority. A few years later, a second Opium War from 1856 to 1860 deepened these humiliations, with new unequal treaties that opened even more of the territory to foreign dominance. Not only England, but also France, the United States, and Russia took advantage of these defeats to demand commercial, extraterritorial, and religious privileges, turning parts of China into spheres of foreign influence. The Qing central power weakened further, and the imperial authority proved incapable of protecting the country. Meanwhile, internally, China was consumed by revolts on an unprecedented scale. The most destructive was the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, an almost apocalyptic conflict led by Hong Xiuquan, who preached a unique religious doctrine and the creation of a new egalitarian state. This movement conquered vast areas of the south, including major cities, and plunged the empire into a bloody civil war, resulting in tens of millions of deaths. The chaos weakened the dynasty even more and destroyed much of the rural economy. Other uprisings also ravaged the country, such as the Nian Rebellion and the Dungan Revolt, while conflicts with Muslim populations in distant regions consumed additional resources. Even when the Qing forces managed to crush these rebellions, the cost in lives and destruction was immense, leaving the empire increasingly vulnerable. At the end of the 19th century, a desperate attempt to expel foreigners gave rise to the Boxer Rebellion from 1899 to 1901. This movement, formed by secret societies, attacked missionaries and foreign communities. The reaction of the Western powers was ruthless. An international alliance invaded Beijing, easily defeated the Qing forces, and imposed even more demands and indemnities. This episode definitively demonstrated that China had lost the ability to defend itself. The Century of Humiliation was not only a period of external defeats, it was also a time of profound internal crises. The rural economy collapsed, the population starved, and the imperial government, corroded by corruption and inefficiency, became incapable of implementing deep reforms. There were timid attempts at modernization, known as the self-strengthening movement and the 100 Days Reform, but they were insufficient in the face of the magnitude of the challenge. This long period of suffering created an open wound in Chinese pride. For the first time in its millennia-old history, China, which for centuries had considered itself the center of the civilized world, found itself subjected to foreign domination and exploitation. National humiliation and the despair of the masses became the catalysts for a new sentiment that radical changes would be necessary to save the country. This conviction prepared the ground for the definitive end of the empire and for China's entry into an era of revolutions. After nearly a century of defeats, foreign pressures and internal crises that undermined the authority of the Qing dynasty, China entered the early 20th century exhausted and on the verge of collapse. The century of humiliation had destroyed confidence in the imperial government and created an explosive scenario in which intellectuals, soldiers, peasants, and merchants called for radical changes. In this atmosphere of desperation and longing for renewal, the Xinhai Revolution arose, a movement that would bring down more than 2,000 years of dynastic tradition and open the doors to a new and turbulent phase in Chinese history, the Republican era. The causes of this revolution were rooted in the Qing government's failure to protect the country from foreign interference and its inability to modernize its institutions. Although there were late attempts at reform, such as the abolition of the imperial examination system and the creation of new military academies, these changes were superficial and came far too late. The educated classes began to draw inspiration from modern ideas coming from Japan and the West, including nationalism, republicanism, and democracy. The figure of Sun Yat-sen, a physician with a Western education and reformist ideals, emerged as the leader of this movement, advocating a program known as the Three Principles of the People: nationalism, democracy, and social welfare. The final spark came on October 10, 1911, in the city of Wuchang, when a military revolt against the Qing government triggered a wave of uprisings across the territory. Within weeks, entire provinces declared independence from the central government. The imperial power, already weakened, had no capacity to respond. In February 1912, the Qing court, under immense pressure, announced the abdication of the last emperor, Puyi, a child who had ascended to the throne in the midst of decline. This act ended a millennia-old tradition of hereditary monarchies that had begun in the time of the earliest legendary dynasties. The Republic of China was proclaimed shortly after the abdication, with Sun Yat-sen taking office as provisional president. However, the new republic was born in an extremely unstable context. Although the fall of the dynasties represented the end of an archaic system, it did not immediately bring unity or prosperity. Very quickly, the country plunged into a struggle for power between different factions, including warlords, military leaders, nationalists, and communists, while the dream of a modern republic collided with the brutal reality of a devastated nation. Even so, the Xinhai Revolution represents a fundamental milestone in Chinese history. For the first time, the people broke away from the dynastic cycle that had defined Chinese politics for more than 2,000 years. The overthrow of the Qing symbolized the rejection of a system that could no longer deal with the challenges of modernity and opened the way for new ideas and forms of government. At the same time, it brought the enormous task of rebuilding a fragmented nation, now exposed to external threats and internal conflicts that would shape the entire 20th century. The end of the empire did not mean the end of difficulties. On the contrary, what followed was a period of constant struggles to define what modern China would become. Nevertheless, the Xinhai Revolution remains the turning point that separates imperial China from a new world, with new ambitions, new pains, and new dreams. With the abdication of Emperor Puyi in 1912 and the proclamation of the Republic of China, an entirely new chapter began in the country's history. However, the transition from a millennia-old empire to a modern republic did not bring immediate stability or progress. On the contrary, it plunged China into a long period of turmoil marked by power struggles, regional fragmentation, and internal conflicts that made it extremely difficult to consolidate a strong national government. Although the Republican ideal represented hope for millions, the reality was a chaotic scenario in which different forces sought to shape the nation's future. The first challenge faced by the new republic was the lack of unity. After the revolution, Sun Yat-sen, regarded as the founding father of the new regime, took the provisional presidency, but soon ceded the position to Yuan Shikai, a powerful general who promised to unify the country. Yuan, however, betrayed republican ideals and attempted to restore the monarchy with himself as emperor, a move that failed and plunged the nation into greater instability. After his death in 1916, the country fragmented completely into regions dominated by independent military leaders, known as warlords, each controlling their territory with private armies. This phase, called the Warlord Era, turned China into a mosaic of rival states with no national coordination. Amid this disorder, two main political forces emerged in the 1920s. On one side was the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang KMT, led by Sun Yat-sen and after his death by Chiang Kai-shek, which advocated a centralized government inspired by Western and Japanese models. On the other side, influenced by the 1917 Russian Revolution, arose the Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921, proposing a radical transformation of society. Initially, the nationalists and communists even attempted to cooperate to reunify China and defeat the warlords, but this alliance was short-lived. After conquering vast territories and moving the capital to Nanjing, Chiang Kai-shek broke with the communists in 1927 and began a bloody civil war that would divide China for decades. As internal conflict intensified, an external threat grew increasingly closer. Japan, seeking territorial expansion and natural resources, began a campaign of aggression against China that culminated in the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the creation of a puppet state called Manchukuo. In 1937, this aggression escalated into a full-scale war, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. The conflict brought destruction on a catastrophic scale, with brutal episodes such as the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. During these years, nationalists and communists formed a temporary alliance to resist the common enemy, but the cooperation was fragile and filled with distrust. This war against Japan became part of the broader context of the Second World War, and China was one of the nations that suffered the most during this period. Millions of civilians died in battles, bombings, and famines caused by the war. Chinese resistance, though heroic, devastated infrastructure and left the country exhausted. When the war ended in 1945 with Japan's defeat, China seemed free from foreign occupation, but its internal wounds were far from healed. With the end of the war, the old alliance between nationalists and communists collapsed completely, and the Civil War resumed with full force. Between 1946 and 1949, the struggle for control of China reached total proportions. Despite foreign support for the nationalists, the growing strength and discipline of the People's Liberation Army, commanded by Mao Zedong, led the communists to victory. In 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and his followers were defeated and fled to the island of Taiwan, while Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Republican period, from 1912 to 1949, is therefore remembered as a time of frustrated hopes. It was an era of modernizing attempts and openness to new ideas, but also of internal divisions, foreign invasions, and immense suffering for the population. Even so, it represented a crucial moment in the transition between the ancient empire and the new China that would emerge under communism. When the Second World War ended in 1945, China was devastated by the Japanese occupation and deeply exhausted. But the end of the conflict with an external enemy brought back the latent struggle, the internal dispute between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. The Civil War, which had already begun before the Japanese invasion, resumed with intensity and on an even larger scale. This conflict would become decisive in shaping the country's destiny and initiating a new political and social era that would forever change the history of China. The Civil War between 1946 and 1949 was marked by extremely violent battles, famine, and destruction. Despite the military and economic support the nationalists received from Western powers, the communist forces proved to be more organized, disciplined, and closer to the rural population. The strategy of the communists was clear: to win the hearts of the peasants by promising land, social justice, and a new system based on equality. This promise found fertile ground in a country devastated by war and misery. The mobilization of the masses gave the communists an insurmountable advantage. Starting in 1948, the communists began achieving decisive victories on several fronts. Well-planned campaigns such as the battles of Huaihai and Pingjin destroyed the nationalist forces and allowed Mao's armies to advance rapidly on the main cities. On October 1, 1949, after the conquest of Beijing, Mao Zedong officially proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square, marking the birth of a new regime. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist allies retreated to the island of Taiwan, establishing a parallel government there, while on the mainland the red flag became the symbol of communist victory. The communist victory meant much more than just a change of government. It represented a radical transformation in the political, economic, and social structure of the country. The Marxist-Leninist ideology, adapted by Mao to Chinese conditions, promised to end feudalism, abolish the exploitation of the rich, and turn China into a modern, independent, and strong nation. In the first years of the regime, a series of deep reforms was implemented. The most impactful was agrarian reform, which redistributed millions of hectares of land previously held by large landowners to poor peasants. This measure radically changed the structure of the Chinese countryside. On the international stage, Communist China quickly aligned itself with the Soviet Union, seeking technical, economic, and military support to accelerate its industrialization. This alliance brought models of centralized planning and helped the country take its first steps toward a more structured economy. At the same time, Mao consolidated a highly centralized state, with a strong Communist Party controlling every aspect of political and social life. However, the 1949 victory also marked the beginning of new challenges. The country was ruined after decades of internal wars and foreign invasions. Infrastructure was precarious, and the population faced extreme poverty. The communist leadership faced the enormous task of rebuilding a country of continental dimensions, while redefining its identity and freeing itself from the shadow of the century of humiliation. Even so, the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 is considered a watershed moment in the country's history. For the first time in centuries, China managed to expel foreign forces and establish a government that declared itself truly independent, sovereign, and determined to break with its imperial and colonial past. This historic milestone ended a long era of fragmentation and opened a new chapter, now under a regime that promised to build a strong, egalitarian, and socialist nation. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the country began a profound transformation under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Mao believed that in order for China to become strong and independent, it needed to break completely with the feudal, agrarian, and backward model inherited from centuries of imperial rule. Thus, the first years of the new regime were marked by radical reforms in all areas of society. The state nationalized banks and industries, abolished the privileges of the old elite, eliminated private ownership of large estates, and redistributed land to poor peasants. These measures sought to create a new social base in which the Communist Party controlled all resources and directed the economy. In the 1950s, with technical support from the Soviet Union, China launched ambitious industrialization plans. Cities filled with factories and steel plants, and millions of peasants were organized into agricultural communes. The goal was to rapidly transform an agricultural country into a modern industrial power. This effort culminated in 1958 with a policy called the Great Leap Forward, perhaps Mao's boldest and most controversial initiative. The idea was to accelerate agricultural and industrial production in just a few years, mobilizing the entire country to reach the level of the most advanced nations. To achieve this, small furnaces were set up in villages to produce steel, and millions of peasants were mobilized for large collective projects. However, the Great Leap Forward was a disaster. The policy, based more on political enthusiasm than on scientific methods, disorganized agricultural production and caused one of the worst famines in human history. It is estimated that tens of millions of people died of starvation between 1959 and 1961. This tragedy damaged Mao's credibility, but also reinforced his conviction that the path of revolution required constant vigilance and permanent ideological mobilization. In the following years, Mao partially withdrew from economic management and gave room for more pragmatic measures led by figures such as Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi, who promoted a degree of economic recovery. However, fearing that these reforms could lead to the emergence of a new elite and betray the principles of the revolution, Mao returned to the center of power in 1966, launching a movement that would drastically change life in China, the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution had the declared objective of eliminating elements considered bourgeois, traditional, or counter-revolutionary, purifying Chinese society. Mao called on the youth to mobilize against authorities, intellectuals, and old customs. Millions of young people, known as Red Guards, traveled across the country attacking teachers, destroying temples, burning books, and denouncing anyone accused of not following the party line. Schools and universities were closed, the economy came to a halt, and the country plunged into a climate of persecution and chaos. During these years, the cult of personality surrounding Mao reached extreme levels. His image was omnipresent, and the Little Red Book with his quotations became a symbol of absolute loyalty. The Cultural Revolution, which officially lasted until 1976, caused profound trauma in Chinese society. Millions of people were humiliated, imprisoned or killed, and the cultural destruction of this period was immense. Despite this, Mao consolidated his position until his death in September 1976. After his death, China entered a new stage. The Communist Party began a process of reviewing previous policies and acknowledged the mistakes that had been made. The era of Mao Zedong left a legacy that was both ambiguous and deeply significant. On one hand, he is remembered for unifying China after centuries of war, restoring national sovereignty, and turning the country into a centralized state, with important advances in health and education for millions of people. On the other hand, his radical policies, especially the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, cost tens of millions of lives and caused long-term social and economic destruction. With Mao's death, a new path was set for China's future, a path that would completely change the face of the country over the following decades. After the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China was deeply scarred by the consequences of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The economy was fragile, infrastructure lagged behind, and society was divided, with years of persecution and instability still fresh in collective memory. In this context, a new leadership rose within the Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping. Unlike Mao, Deng adopted a pragmatic stance, making economic recovery and modernization the absolute priorities. Thus began an era of reforms known as reform and opening up, which would transform China within a few decades and change its role in the world. Starting in the late 1970s, Deng promoted radical changes in the way the economy was managed. He maintained the socialist political regime, but introduced market mechanisms in a system officially called socialism with Chinese characteristics. Agricultural communes were dissolved, and peasants regained autonomy over their plots, being allowed to sell surplus production. This simple adjustment quickly increased productivity and alleviated hunger in rural areas. At the same time, the government began opening sectors of the economy to private companies and foreign capital, something unthinkable during Mao's era. One of Deng's most important strategies was the creation of special economic zones, regions such as Shenzhen and Xiamen, where foreign companies enjoyed tax benefits and freedom to invest. These zones became industrial and technological hubs that grew at an impressive pace, turning small towns into modern metropolises. This opening made China attract capital, technology, and expertise from abroad, accelerating an industrialization process that the country alone would never have achieved in such a short time. During the 1980s and 1990s, these reforms changed the face of the Chinese economy. Millions of people migrated from rural areas to cities, and a vast contingent of cheap labor fueled Chinese exports to every continent. The country became known as the factory of the world, producing on a massive scale everything from clothing and electronics to machinery and equipment. This transformation was not only economic, it profoundly changed Chinese society, creating a new urban middle class and altering living standards that had remained virtually the same for centuries. Despite its economic success, this period also brought challenges and tensions. The opening created inequalities between the more industrialized coastal regions and the rural interior. Furthermore, economic liberalization was not accompanied by political openness. This contradiction culminated in popular demonstrations for greater freedom and against corruption, the most notable being the protest in Tiananmen Square in 1989, which ended in violent repression and left deep marks on the government's image. Even with these tensions, Deng stayed the course with reforms. Under his leadership and that of his successors, China managed in just a few decades to move from widespread poverty to becoming the world's second-largest economy. Moreover, the modernization policy also included advances in science, technology, and defense, preparing China for a new role in global geopolitics. The era of Deng Xiaoping represents a historic turning point. For the first time since the beginning of the century of humiliation, China became a power with an active voice on the international stage. His pragmatic strategy, maintaining firm political control while opening space for economic initiative, allowed the country to follow a unique path that was neither the Soviet model nor the purely capitalist model of the West. This period opened the doors to the China we know today, modern, urbanized, with an economy integrated into the world, yet still facing social and political challenges. Deng's legacy was to lay the foundations for the country to leave behind the image of a backward nation and to be seen as an emerging global force. China's entry into the 21st century marked the consolidation of a process that began with Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the transformation of the country into a global power with an impact on every aspect: economic, political, scientific, and cultural. After more than a century of humiliation, wars, and instability, China, in the new millennium, became one of the engines of global growth. Its rise has brought such profound changes that it has not only reshaped its own society, but has also altered the international geopolitical balance. The economic growth that began in the 1980s reached unprecedented levels during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Chinese cities became megacities, filled with skyscrapers, financial hubs, and technology centers. Millions of people rose out of poverty, becoming part of a new urban middle class. China became the world leader in manufacturing and exports, producing everything from simple goods to high-tech products. Its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 accelerated this process, providing access to new markets and strengthening its global economic integration. Technological innovation became one of the main symbols of this new phase. The country invested massively in research, education, and digital infrastructure. Today, China is a reference in technologies such as artificial intelligence, 5G networks, renewable energy, and space exploration. Chinese companies gained global prominence: Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, and BYD, competing in fields that were previously dominated by Western powers. At the same time, the country launched ambitious space programs, placing probes on the Moon and Mars and building its own space station, signaling its ambition for scientific leadership. But this rise is not only economic and technological. Politically, China began to play a central role in international diplomacy. Through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, it created a network of investments and infrastructure that extends across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, expanding its global influence. The modernization of its armed forces also brought about a strategic repositioning on the international stage. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, Chinese foreign policy has become more assertive, increasingly defending national interests in a direct way. On the other hand, this accelerated growth has brought significant internal challenges. Social inequality remains a problem, particularly between the more developed urban areas and the rural interior. Rapid urbanization and large-scale industrialization have also generated serious environmental issues, such as air pollution, river contamination, and desertification in some regions. In response, the government has begun adopting policies aimed at clean energy and reforestation, but environmental issues remain one of the country's greatest obstacles. Another challenge is internal political tension. The Communist Party maintains absolute control of power, and the absence of political openness continues to be the subject of internal and external criticism. Issues related to human rights, freedom of expression, and tensions in regions such as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet remain points of conflict and international pressure. Nevertheless, 21st century China is undeniably a global power. In just a few decades, it has gone from a fragile state to one of the most dynamic centers of development, innovation, and cultural and political influence on the planet. This growth has redefined the country's role in the world, from a nation that for centuries was isolated or subjected to foreign interference to an active and strategic protagonist in the international arena. This new era represents for China not only the fulfillment of a long quest for modernization, but also a return to the position of leadership that the country had already held in antiquity. The 21st century is, therefore, both a symbol of historical recovery and an open field for new challenges. Chinese culture is one of the most enduring and fascinating pillars of human civilization. More than monuments or military conquests, it has for millennia shaped the way entire generations have thought, felt, and related to the world. This culture, formed from a legacy of oral tradition, classical texts, and daily practices, remains alive even in the face of the political and technological changes that have transformed the country. Its depth lies in the way philosophy, spirituality, art, and science intertwine into a unique system that has influenced not only China, but also many neighboring cultures. At the heart of Chinese culture are the philosophical systems that were born in antiquity and still resonate today. Confucianism shaped ethics, politics, and social customs, with its emphasis on respect for ancestors, the value of family, and the balance between duty and virtue. Taoism brought a more contemplative vision, based on harmony with nature, simplicity, and the flow of the Tao, the universal path that governs all things. Buddhism, which came from India, found fertile ground in China, and over the centuries became so deeply integrated that it gave rise to distinct schools such as Chan Buddhism, which later became Zen in Japan. These three traditions complemented one another, creating a mosaic of thought that shaped Chinese society and spirituality. Another fundamental aspect is traditional Chinese medicine, a millennia-old system that seeks to understand health as a balance between opposing and complementary forces, yin and yang, and the harmonious flow of vital energy, known as qi. This holistic view uses methods such as acupuncture, herbal medicine, therapeutic massage, tuina, and dietary practices to prevent and treat diseases. Although different from Western medicine, these practices continue to be an integral part of the lives of millions of Chinese people and have been gaining recognition around the world. Chinese martial arts, known as wushu or kung fu, are also part of this cultural legacy. Originally created as techniques of defense and combat, they were deeply influenced by philosophical and spiritual concepts, transforming into practices that aim at both self-defense and the mental discipline and strengthening of the body. Over the centuries, different styles developed, inspired by the movements of nature and the teachings of monks, warriors, and masters. Today, they stand as symbols of Chinese culture and as a bridge between past and present. Chinese art and literature likewise reveal the richness of this civilization. Calligraphy, considered one of the highest forms of artistic expression, unites aesthetics and philosophy, turning characters into visual poetry. Traditional painting, with its serene landscapes and delicate brushwork, seeks to capture not only the form but also the essence of the world. Classical poetry, from the simple verses of the Tang Dynasty to more complex works, reflects universal human emotions and, at the same time, a deep perception of nature and time. Alongside these, Chinese opera, with its music, masks, and codified gestures, remains one of the most sophisticated theatrical expressions in the world. The worship of ancestors and traditional festivals are also central elements of cultural life. Celebrations such as the Spring Festival, Chinese New Year, the Dragon Boat Festival, and the Mid-Autumn Festival keep traditions alive, blending myths, history, and family unity. These events reinforce the bond between generations and the importance of the collective over the individual. Thus, Chinese culture is more than a set of customs. It is a foundation that has spanned thousands of years, capable of renewing itself without losing its essence. In a country that has undergone enormous transformations, from feudal kingdoms to empires, from invasions to revolutions, and finally into a modern giant, this culture remains a bridge that connects past, present, and future. The history of China is inseparable from its scientific and technological contributions, which have spanned millennia and shaped not only the country's own destiny, but also had a profound impact on the development of humanity. Since ancient times, the quest to understand and master natural phenomena has led to inventions and discoveries that became essential parts of human progress. Some of these creations were born from practical needs, others from intellectual curiosity, but all carry the hallmark of Chinese ingenuity. Among the most emblematic inventions is the compass, developed in antiquity from the observation of the magnetic properties of lodestone. Initially used to align buildings and ceremonies according to the principles of feng shui, this tool eventually became indispensable for maritime navigation. It was the compass that allowed Chinese explorers, and later peoples from other parts of the world, to expand their horizons, transforming global trade. Another extraordinary innovation was paper, created during the Han Dynasty, which revolutionized how knowledge was recorded and disseminated. Woodblock printing and later movable type made it possible to reproduce texts, books, and Buddhist sutras on a large scale, democratizing access to information centuries before this process began in Europe. Another transformative invention was gunpowder, discovered by Chinese alchemists in the 9th century after Christ, originally as part of experiments in the search for immortality. Over time, it began to be used in fireworks and weapons, forever changing the history of warfare. The production of porcelain, so characteristic of the country that its name became synonymous with the material, also exemplifies Chinese technical skill, blending aesthetics and science. Beyond these, China pioneered advanced agricultural techniques, the development of the seismograph to detect earthquakes, the creation of complex irrigation systems, and improvements to the loom. Over the centuries, even during periods of political instability, the inventive spirit never disappeared. During the Song Dynasty, for example, there was an authentic explosion of innovations. In addition to the improved compass and paper money, there were advances in hydraulic engineering, astronomy, and medicine. This creative environment profoundly influenced not only the domestic economy, but also other cultures that came into contact with Chinese products and knowledge. In the 21st century, this millennia-old tradition found new strength. China began to systematically invest in science and technology, seeking to regain the leadership it had lost in previous centuries. Today, it is one of the countries that invests the most in research and development, with a focus on areas such as artificial intelligence, renewable energy, biotechnology, and quantum computing. Its space race has become a symbol of this technological revival. Chinese probes have landed on the Moon and Mars, satellites have been launched for scientific exploration, and its own space station has been built, showing the world that the ancient agricultural nation is now at the forefront of knowledge. This trajectory shows that China's pursuit of knowledge is not a recent phenomenon, but a continuous thread that runs through dynasties and revolutions. From the compass that guided ancient sailors to the rockets that now cross Earth's orbit, China demonstrates a unique ability to unite tradition and innovation. Each advance reflects a civilization that has never stopped looking toward the horizon, whether on Earth or beyond it. The legacy of China for humanity is immense and extends far beyond geographical borders. It is a legacy built over more than 5,000 years of continuous history, leaving deep marks on politics, philosophy, art, science, and global culture. Since the most remote times, China has played the role of a unique civilizational center, radiating ideas, technologies, and values that were absorbed and transformed by other peoples throughout the centuries. One of the most remarkable aspects of this legacy is its philosophical and spiritual contribution. Systems of thought developed in ancient China, such as Confucianism and Taoism, shaped not only Chinese society itself, but also deeply influenced life in neighboring countries such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Buddhism, although originated in India, found fertile ground in China to flourish and create schools that later expanded throughout East Asia. These teachings, emphasizing harmony, moral discipline, and balance, continue to inspire millions of people around the world. In science and technology, China was one of the birthplaces of inventions that changed global history. The compass, gunpowder, paper, and printing, often called the four great inventions of China, opened paths to global transformations, from European maritime expansion to the scientific revolution. Porcelain, silk, and tea are also not just typical products. They became central elements in international trade, connecting China to commercial networks that shaped the global economy. In the cultural sphere, Chinese art has left an indelible mark. Calligraphy, landscape painting, jade sculptures, and monumental constructions, such as the Great Wall and the Forbidden City, stand as testimonies of the aesthetic refinement and ingenuity of this civilization. Literary works such as Dream of the Red Chamber or Romance of the Three Kingdoms are among the greatest classics of world literature, while the poetry of the Tang and Song dynasties continues to be studied as one of the most profound expressions of human sensitivity. The model of a centralized and bureaucratic state created in China also influenced other societies. From very early on, the Chinese Empire developed mechanisms of administration and selection of officials based on merit and study, a system that inspired practices in various regions of the world. In addition, the notion of the mandate of heaven, which associated the right to rule with the morality of the ruler, created a concept of political legitimacy that still echoes in modern reflections on ethics and leadership. In the 21st century, the Chinese legacy continues to expand. Now driven by globalization, Chinese cuisine is appreciated on every continent, martial arts are practiced as a philosophy of life in different cultures, and contemporary Chinese cinema, music, and literature reach global audiences. At the same time, technology produced in China is an active part of the daily lives of billions of people, demonstrating that the country maintains its vocation for innovation. This legacy is also a story of resilience and continuity. Despite invasions, wars, and internal crises, China has managed to preserve its language, customs, and traditions, adapting without losing its essence. Today, it represents the synthesis of an ancient civilization and a modern power, aware that its contribution to the world lies not only in the past, but also in the present and future. With this accumulated heritage, China remains one of the great centers of creation, reflection, and transformation of humanity. Its history shows that the material and spiritual achievements of a people can span millennia and still shape the way we think, work, and live.